Okay, hey everybody. Last recorded lecture here for animal behavior. Today we're going to talk about the most interesting animal of them all, the human. Um, Frankly, I'm perfectly fine recording this from my desk without anybody looking at me, because this is a pretty interesting topic, pretty interesting lecture, but sometimes a little embarrassing. All right, let's get right to it. So the point of today, hold on, let me go back. So the point of today, kind of what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, we're going to highlight some themes. We're going to review some themes that we've talked about throughout the semester. We're going to talk about them in the context of human behavior. Okay, so there's nothing new here in terms of ideas or principles or material. It's just how does this apply to humans? Okay. So first thing that I wanted to talk about was how does sexual selection work in humans? There's lots of different things that we could talk about here, and I'll talk about a few. Um, the first one is this idea of fertility and the effect that fertility has on attractiveness. So this makes sense and is a common thing that you see in the animal world, the rest of the animals. So, for example, I have a neighbor who has a dog, a female dog. She's not fixed, and so she is often reproductively active, receptive, and when she is, she puts off pheromones and she also kind of roams around. She doesn't stay in her yard, and all the male dogs. There's a few male dogs in particular that always come around and are always looking for her, and they're being attracted to that fertility, that cycle, right? So there's some evidence that that occurs in humans as well, although the evidence that we use pheromones is somewhat weak, in that, in particular, we lack the structure in our nose for basically for receiving those pheromones. So there's some weak evidence that we do use pheromones to a degree. But there are other aspects of uh, female reproductive biology that might be reflected um, in their appearance. And men tend to find women, there's quite a bit of experimental evidence on this. Men tend to find women more attractive when they're near ovulation, when they're most fertile. Okay. This applies to things like the voice, smell, and haha, dance moves. And we'll look at another example of that in just a minute. So some believe that these cues are quote unquote leaked as a byproduct of female reproductive behavior or biology. And what they mean by this term leaked is that they're kind of they're signals that are sort of escaping unintentionally, right? So there's some aspect of female reproductive biology that changes appearance, changes the tone of your voice, changes your dance moves, whatever, and something about that is kind of getting through in some subconscious way to males and affecting their attractiveness. Um, so I want you to think for a minute, and we're not in class, but you guys can maybe think about this, discuss this, maybe with your roommate or a classmate. Why might this ability to detect these male cues have evolved, or these cues have evolved in males? Okay, think about that. So hopefully you had some good thoughts. Pause if you haven't, and because I'm going to discuss some now. So if you think back to this example of my neighbor's dog, uh, it's very obvious there why those males have evolved the ability to detect her fertility, because that is when she is receptive. And if a male can detect that fertility, even though the male's reproductive contribution is relatively minimal, um, it still is costly. It still takes those males a lot of energy to run across Laie and find her and pursue her. And so, for a male to be able to detect that, he can essentially focus his efforts on females that are receptive, females that are fertile. And the idea is similar with humans, right? If you think way back to our ancestors who perhaps were not engaging in, uh, long-term relationships, they needed this ability to detect the fertility in potential mates to increase their fitness. And, and if you had that ability, then you passed on that ability, and that is how it likely perpetuated. Okay, I mentioned this idea that dance moves could change with fertility, and one of the studies that actually reflects this is a study of exotic dancers and looking at their tip earnings. Um, and those tip earnings peak during estrus. Okay, so essentially when females are most fertile, um, and if you compare dancers that were using hormonal contraception, they didn't see any such peak. So there's a graph there. There's the pill users with the dotted line and the normal cycling in the solid line. Um, and basically, there's this peak during the period in which females are ovulating and are found more attractive in some way, and that led to, in this case, I mean, the idea here is that led to higher tips, right? So kind of a raunchy study, but an interesting idea that these behaviors can be, there can be some cue that is affecting the attractiveness of a female by from the perspective of a male. And we'll actually come back later and talk a little bit more about other potential effects of hormonal contraception on human behavior. Um, so fertility can also affect sexual preferences for females of males, and this varies based on the state of the timing of the menstruation cycle. So this was some interesting work where they took images of men and they altered those images to make the man either look more masculine or less masculine. So in the example here on the right, so just take a look at that photo and look at both of those men. It's actually the same person, but the photos have been altered. Which one looks more manly and which one looks less manly? So you probably said the guy on the right looks more manly. He's got a square jaw. He's got a thicker brow. He's got he's got thicker eyebrows. His forehead, his hairline is different. He's got more of a widow's peak. Eye shape's a little bit different. Um, so so that individual would appear more manly in that case, which could reflect higher testosterone levels. And females' preference for these males. So they've done this with studies looking at females and their different parts of their menstruation cycle. They've presented images of these males, and on average, this is similar to that beard study that we talked about a while ago. Actually, that was on the test. So they showed women images, and they ranked their preferences, and that preference depended in part on their menstruation cycle. So manly men were preferred during ovulation. Yet in other studies, the same manly men were perceived as dishonest, uncooperative, and more interested in short-term flings. So it's interesting. You think about these preferences, and while a female is ovulating, she might have a preference for this more masculine man, despite all these negative side effects, right? Um, and the rest of the time, she's maybe more attracted to a less manly man who is probably less dishonest or perceived as less dishonest, less cooperative, or more cooperative and more interested in long-term relationships. So I want you to think about for a minute how hormonal contraceptives could affect mate preferences. Okay, hormonal contraceptives. If you know what a hormonal contraceptive does, it actually makes a woman mimic or confuses the body. It kind of mimics the state of pregnancy. And so your body does not release the eggs. And if you actually look at mate preferences, women tend to prefer less masculine faces while they're on the pill. And if they were to marry partners with less masculine faces on the pill, with their mate preferences affected by, by that, by the pill, then they get off the pill later in life, and maybe then they don't find their mate so attractive. Another issue is that because the pill, hormonal contraceptives, uh, cause a woman's body to, it basically mimics a state of pregnancy. Uh, During a state of pregnancy, females tend to have a higher affinity for people that are more like them. Okay, and that includes people who are similar to them in terms of their immunity genes, specifically MHC, major histocompatibility complex, immunity genes. So there's a number of steps here, so stick with me here. So if you mate with somebody, if two individuals with uh, similar MHC immunity genes mate with each other, they tend to have lower immune function. So it's more fit to mate with somebody who has different MHC immunity genes than you do. However, when women are on the pill, that influences their mate preference because it makes them prefer, or it can influence their preference such that they prefer individuals with similar MHC immunity genes. The thought there is that when individuals are pregnant, they have more of an affinity towards their relatives who can help them out in their pregnancy and so on and so forth, who are more likely to have the same MHC immunity genes. But the consequence here is that women end up selecting mates with more similar MHC immunity genes, and so therefore could be producing offspring with lower immunity functioning. Okay, hopefully that made sense. The take home is hormonal contraceptions affect mate choice, and it could affect mate choice in a negative way, or in a way that could have negative consequences later on down the road. So more on preferences. So manly men tend to be preferred when health risks are highest, okay, because those manly features could be perceived as more healthy. So that's another potential, or sort of a conditionally dependent selection here. So females kind of alter their preference based on their own health condition. So that's interesting. Oh, there's George Costanza for your Seinfeld references. So there's some other interesting traits that are preferred or not preferred in mates. So if you think about hairiness, okay, there's some nice back hair there. Sorry, it's kind of gross. Um, why might why might women prefer relatively less hairy men? One thought is that preferences, and so kind of thinking about what drives these traits, these preferences, right? So one thought is that preferences for reduced body hair could have come about because it is more clear whether an individual has parasites. Okay, so if you got a big hairy body, it's harder to see, your skin. It's harder to look for signs of infection, signs of diseases, parasites, and so clear skin allows an easier way to assess that. So if you think about, over evolutionary time, preferences for more clear skin, less hairy body could have been beneficial if it increased the fitness of those females who are choosing those traits. Just another odd one. So in looking at preferences in mates in humans, and there's some of this that occurs, there's quite a bit of learning that's involved in mate preference in animals as well. But in humans, there's some evidence that young individuals learn mating preferences from their interactions with adults, so often their parents. And the idea here is that they form a template of the opposite sex during early development. So a female will form a template of, what the opposite sex should look like through her interactions with her dad. And then that template is kind of used as a guide to find a mate later in life. And there's some interesting evidence of this. And that evidence is that subjects in a study can accurately identify a woman's mother-in-law when shown a picture of the woman. So the idea there is that basically men marry women who look like their mom. And the evidence for that is that, if I were to give you a bunch of pictures and said, which one of these is the mother-in-law of this woman, and I showed you a picture of that woman, that you'd probably be able to pick it out because she looks like the woman. Okay, so there's kind of a weak correlation there, but it's an interesting idea. So how could we test better if this is really happening? This so far is just kind of what we've talked about is just kind of observational. So I want you to think for a minute of how you could test this. What kind of experiment could you do if it were ethical to humans to see if they are actually learning preferences for mates during their early childhood? So one idea would be cross fostering. Okay, so this could be done in like twin studies to see if twins are maybe forming preferences for or swapping kids around between families and seeing if they're forming preferences for their biological dad or the dad who's fostering them or the mom who's fostering. You could also use a novel trait approach. This would be a little trickier, but you could have offspring that are raised by parents that have some sort of novel trait that's introduced by an experimenter. So let's say you draw a big red dot on their forehead or something, and then you give them the option between individuals with or without that trait. So that's a little more far-fetched, harder to do in humans, but definitely uh, could help answer this question, and definitely possible in animals. And these approaches have been used in animals quite a bit. Okay, so moving on, let's talk for a minute about sibling rivalry. So there's a lot of interesting work on sibling rivalry in animals. And we've talked a little bit about that. We talked about sibling competition and parent-offspring conflict. So this is one example here. This is a masked booby, a bird where siblicide is common, but that siblicide, so killing your sibling, basically running them out of the nest, is common, but only during food shortages. So this might ring a bell. If you grew up in a family with lots of kids, um, you might have had some battles over dinner that could theoretically lead to some siblicide if your parents didn't step in. So siblings usually this kind of reflects this pattern that siblings usually want what's best for other individuals or for both individuals, except when resources are limited. So if things get tough, you want your sibling to survive because you are getting some indirect fitness benefits there. Um, but when the going gets tough, then those interests get a little muted. Okay, so we recently talked about parent-offspring conflict. And this is the idea that parents and their dependent offspring are under different selection pressures. So parents want to maximize their lifetime reproductive success, while offspring want to maximize their own survival by demanding more energy and protection from the parents so that they can survive to reproductive age. So parents should want to invest equally in their offspring, okay, trying to maximize the number of their offspring. So think back to kin selection and coefficient of relatedness and everything. Whereas offspring optimize their fitness by maximizing parental investment in themselves. So remember, parental investment is something that benefits the offspring, but comes at a cost to the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. So, so that benefit could be strong, could be high, and that could be also affected. That sibling rivalry could be affected if they have different dads, because then that coefficient of relatedness becomes lower than that 0.5, and then they want even more for themselves. They care even less about their siblings. And I'll encourage you to read a brief synopsis of gestational diabetes and how that can be explained by parent-offspring conflict theory. Really cool study, really cool idea. And hint, hint, there will be an extra credit question on this on the final exam. Okay, so read that, have a look at that, maybe get some extra credit points. Okay, we also recently talked about we talked about altruism, and there's some interesting work in neuroeconomics and this idea of reciprocity and how that could factor in, and this kind of becomes related to game theory as well. So this game here is called the Prisoner's Dilemma game. The R in the top left is the reward for mutual cooperation. The S in the top right it's called the sucker's payoff. Um, the T is for the temptation to cheat, payoff, and the P is the punishment for mutual defection, payoff. So in this case, in this game, so you imagine you got two prisoners and you're interrogating them separately. Um, the two of them could cooperate. One could cooperate, or and the other could defect, or they could both defect or both cheat. So in this case, the highest payoff that an individual can get is if they defect um, and the other individual cheats. Sorry, if they cheat or they defect and the other individual tries to cooperate. If both individuals defect or cheat, they get a little bit of a payoff. They get a little bit more of a payoff, that R, reward for mutual cooperation, if they both cooperate. But this temptation to cheat is present because, if they rat out their friend and then they end up getting all the blame, they could be, released from prison or whatever it is in the situation. But in this case, you get more money. So if you put people in these situations, there's this temptation to cheat, but also some incentive to behave altruistically and reciprocate when other individuals are cooperating. And interestingly, when both individuals cooperate, their brain areas in their brains are activated that are associated with reward processing. Okay, so they put people in an MRI and an fMRI that could monitor their brain activity in real time, and then they put them in this situation and they had them defect or cheat. And when they cooperated, there were some reward centers there. So the idea there is that could favor that cooperation, that trust in the other individual could be driven by that, that the average win that you could get, right? On average, you get more if you cooperate than if you try to defect. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is this idea of evolutionary mismatch. So we've talked a lot about habitat preferences, foraging behavior, and how individuals will behave in such a way that will optimize their foraging efficiency and so on and so forth. So we are in a really interesting situation because as humans, for much of our history, resources have been limited. Okay, so you think of people like the San Bushmen in South Africa. They live in incredibly primitive conditions. Resources are highly limited. And we evolved from that type of environment. Okay. Now, we're in an environment where resources are abundant. In particular, resources that are fatty, resources that are sugary. So I want you to discuss for a minute why, and this has become a really big problem, right? Obesity is on the rise, all sorts of negative health impacts associated with that. Why might humans crave sugary and fatty foods despite the negative effects in our modern environment? Okay, think a second about that, why you might expect that to be the case. Okay, I'm moving on. So the idea here is that, if you look at our sort of this primitive human environment, fatty, oily, sugary foods were not particularly common. Okay, fruit was only common during certain seasons. Um, Fatty foods such as nuts and whatnot, and even foods that are high in protein, meats that were killed and whatnot, were not incredibly common. Okay, so that craving for those things means that when you do come across, a ripe berry bush or, some high sugar, high fat resource, you eat as much as possible. You crave it, you eat as much as possible, store up as much as you can. So nowadays, we still have that. The idea here is that we still have that drive Yet we have those things that are available to us basically in an unlimited measure. So we're mismatched with our environment. We've evolved in one environment, and now we've been put in a different environment where those traits that were once beneficial are now contributing to our demise in many ways, in terms of our personal health. Um, so, you know, you can't blame yourself, beat up on yourself too much when you're craving a Twinkie or an M&M covered brownie or a sugary soda, because that is what your body has been designed to crave. Because in the past, those things were not incredibly common. Now that they're abundant, we need to be careful. We need to be careful not to eat all that fat, all that sugar, because we'll end up on the wrong side of the scale, on the wrong side of heart disease, and all sorts of other health problems. Okay, so just something to think about. All right, I think that's it. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I'm sure you've got plenty of things that you can talk about with your roommates or your neighbor or your spouse or whatever. Uh, and I will catch you guys later. Adios.